trafficking in Nepal. I'm from Nepal, so my research is based on Nepal. I'm looking into the challenges, perspective, and good practice. Nepal, as you know, is the least developed countries with a population of 30 million people, and trafficking of women and children is not a recent phenomenon. You can trace back to the 1940s, where our Agrana rulers exploited young girls as slaves. So there's been a lot of effort in this area already. But then my research tries to look into why is it still a problem then, since there's a lot of funding. We've ratified the international convention like CEDAW, CRC, but despite that, children are still vulnerable to trafficking, child labor, and street children, for instance. So my research looks into what's the problem then with the international commitment we have ratifying the conventions, and what's the reality, what's the practice like, where are the gaps. But then if you look into the policy, we have adopted most of the policy, international policy, in the national framework. We have Children's Act in place, we have Human Trafficking Control Act, but then when it comes to interventions, there's a huge gap. And my research my theoretical framework would be looking in from the CRC framework, Child Rights Framework, and the sociology of childhood. I'm looking into the definition of childhood as to how do we understand childhood in the first place, the whole idea around multiple explanation of childhood. So that's one element. So some of the key findings, I finished my fieldwork, two fieldwork already. Based on that, I've found that there are three primary destinations of trafficking in Nepal. One is cross-border trafficking to India. That's the dominant discourses where women and children especially are trafficked to India, because we share open border with India, so that's a problem. And trafficking outside the region, Gulf countries, even European countries, and internal trafficking, which is not considered trafficking by the government officials. Based on some of my interviews, young girls are especially trafficked for entertainment business, nighttime economy, where they are exploited in massage parlors, tourist destinations like dance bars and clubs. So some of the causes, of course, most of the research focuses on the economic factors, that poverty being one of the main reasons of trafficking, but my research tries to argue that it's not just economy. There are other factors, such as the weak child protection system. We do not have a child protection system where they protect children. Child abuse, neglect, working children is another problem. Discriminatory practices is another problem, and even the cultural belief. So that's some of the arguments. In terms of intervention, what I found out that most of the interventions are based on donors' agenda, if I can say that. So basically focused on the 3 Ps, the prevention, prosecution, and protection, but not much is done on participation based on the CRC principle. Participation should be a key indicator of how do we understand the intervention itself. So I look into the clubs, child clubs. I interviewed them as to what are their roles in anti-trafficking interventions. That's one bit. And prosecution is one of the most challenging. Not many traffickers are caught. Even if they're caught because of corruption or political protection, they are let loose. So that's another challenges. Yeah, and some of the other challenges would be the definition. How do we understand child? Because CRC would say 18 years old, but in Nepal, the national law says a child below the age of 16. So there's already a difference in the laws itself. So that's problematic. And also, how do we understand trafficking? Like I said, internal trafficking is not considered trafficking. So how do we understand the whole idea around how do you understand trafficking in the first place? Victim identification is one of the main problems. How do we identify victim? I earlier told you that there are different layers. Like if a child is stopped at the border, do we consider them as a victim, or is it just a migrant child? So there are lots of problems behind identifying immediate identification, and of course weak prosecution. We don't have a specialized counter-trafficking investigation unit. Corruption is another problem. Lack of resources. Most of the budget are spent in other factors than on children's issues. So that's one of the problems we have. And also the protection system itself. We do have some ministerial coordination, but it's not that integrated. So based on what I've done, my research, I could say that it's more issue-based rather than an integrated approach, and that's something I want to argue. It has to be more issue-based and a bottom approach to address the problem of trafficking in Nepal. That's it.
Yeah, this is, as you can see with the photo, this is me. My name is Francisca. I'm doing a PhD in anthropology at SOAS in London, and I've been in Zanzibar for the past 18 months looking at children's perceptions, which I was trying to visualize here, of child protection, of what is being done as child protection in schools, in Quranic schools, and in primary schools in urban Zanzibar, in Stone Town. I really try to have this as visual based as possible, so come closer or come after so you can actually see what's there. What's being done in Zanzibar in Quranic schools, which we see here, or in state primary schools, are programs that try to make teachers use other disciplinary methods than caning. So here we have like some canes on one of the head teacher's tables, which is the normal way of disciplining children in educational spaces. And what organizations like Save the Children, together with the Zanzibar state, are now trying to do is trying to suggest to use positive discipline, whatever that is, for the teachers to use other measures of disciplining children, alternative measures, other methods of trying to instill discipline, but in a less physical or in a less perceived as violent way. What I was looking at then was what children say about their teachers now trying to use other ways, for example telling them, you're going to have to bring a broom tomorrow because you didn't do your homework, but I can't hit you, so bring a broom. And how the kids feel about that now, what implications these alternatives have, because very often this has effects that are not, or this had effects that weren't really taken into consideration by organizations like Save the Children or UNICEF, who are very leading in that field in the area where I was. And then children explaining, well, this is actually much more difficult than being hit, because if I have to bring a broom, I'm going to have to go home, I'm going to have to say, Mom, I messed up, I need a broom. Well, I don't have money to buy you a broom. So now the mom or the dad or whoever the kid goes to is kind of forward the punishment to, which takes the whole thing to another level, and which then, in the way that the children explained to me, rather took the agency of dealing with the situation themselves away from them and complicated the situation by involving the wider structures and maybe punishing the parent for the kid not being able to solve this and have it sorted. So I was looking at how these ideas really play out in children's social relationships, in child-child relationships, child-adult relationships in their daily lives, how this is navigated or mediated through their bodies in other ways of defining protection and in other ways of looking at punishment as such a, often physical kind of way. Then looking at how gender and age played into this, and looking at how adult and child discourses go together or collided in Zanzibar. And I was there for 18 months, and I was in 4 primary schools and in 2 madrasas. And I had a group of 10 children in each school, in each Quranic school and in each primary school, that I met with every week or every 2 weeks, and I did a lot of what I thought was participatory research with them, or what I assumed to be child-friendly or child-led, which also turned out to be way more complicated than I had hoped. But we did photo voice, draw and write, story writing, focus group discussions. 1 minute, okay. So I'll be happy to talk about this later. Here are some photos that the kids had come out from their photo voice workshop that show 2 of the concepts that kind of came out as most crucial for the kind of way that I was trying to approach protection in another, in a less Eurocentric way. And that was adabu and adabu, which in Swahili mean manners or discipline, and punishment. And these came out to be rather interrelated with personhood, which is also why I found very interesting what we were talking about earlier. And adabu, or manners or discipline, in a way not being able to just be replaced by another form of discipline, because then you are not assumed to be able to be corrected in a way that you could have that you could have or that you could reach the desired level of personhood or of sociability in your society, and this was therefore at stake, and this is what I am now going to argue in my thesis, is that that is why often these protection interventions actually come to be rejected, because they do not go in line with what is understood to be necessary to become a moral functioning adult. Okay. Thank you.
So, this is about my thesis dissertation. I defended my thesis last September. It's about social and political construction of childhood in Egypt from in chronological period. Is from 18th until 2011. This precise chronological period is because it's the period of when Hosni Mubarak, the President Hosni Mubarak, was the President of Egypt, and he was stepped down in 2011 following the Egyptian Revolution and January Revolution. So, during Mubarak's mandate, childhood was at the core of his policies agenda for education and protection reforms, and many action for childhood was aimed at establish principal institutions like such as a National Council for Childhood Motherhood in 1988, and also to define political strategies. There were during this period many actions. The Egyptian government actions were addressed to children protection and education, and above all preschool education. The main research question is why did the Egyptian government start to invest in younger children care and education since 18th, and what is the impact of public investment on childhood, on the young children, and in order to answer these questions, I explored exogenous and endogenous factors being behind those investments, and also try to explain how these factors impact on children's life and the process of construction of childhood. For a theoretical point of view, I adopted childhood studies theories, particularly theories by Jens Komfutub, for which childhood is an integrated structural element in organized social life, and it's changed in times and space in accordance with the context. So I try to put a relation, to put in connection childhood studies and Middle East studies, because normally my specialization is Middle East studies, and I try to analyze the situation, the children condition and the childhood construction from the childhood studies point of view. For the methods, I adopted quantitative data, analysis of quantitative data, and with the collecting of qualitative data, I made fieldwork in Egypt from 2005 until 2009 Yeah, the result is that the convergence of exogenous factors means global trends for the internationalization of children care and education, and the endogenous factors means changing in Egyptian women's status and fertility rate. Our impact, this convergence of these factors had the impact on Egyptian children care and education conditions. In fact, public policies for protection, for children protection, aimed at increasing immunization of the children, and also to increase public kindergartens. So in conclusion, I can say that childhood in Egypt is constructed by state actions and discourse, influenced by exogenous factors, but also it's not only for this point it's influenced by exogenous factors, but also endogenous factors and economic factors. And the state interventions on children create a model of a child protected and preschooled in Egypt during this period. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Jeannie Afroz. I'm a first-year PhD student at the Open University. My research aims to explore the risks and resilience of children who are living in urban slums in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is, probably all of you know, that is a highly populated country, and increasingly the urbanization is increasing in a great number in Bangladesh, with a large number of people every year migrating from rural areas to urban areas with the hope of getting job opportunities and other economic prospects. Along with these, a large number of children are also coming to the capital of Bangladesh mostly, which is Dhaka, and due to the lack of opportunities that they get, they end up living in slums, which is highly densely populated area, and which do not have the capacity to fulfill the basic services that is required for these people and children. So from my experience of working with Save the Children in Bangladesh for 6 years in Child Protection Program, I have learned that children who are living in slums, every day they face lots of abuse and exploitation. They have lack of family care. They end up being doing work in the street. They're involved in hazardous work at informal sectors. They have stigma associated with them, insecurity, and all sorts of risks that they face in everyday lives. But what we don't know is what are their understanding of the risks and vulnerabilities, and what is the resilience that they have that help them to thrive even living in that difficult situation. So in my research, I want to explore and work with children to know how do the children and the adults understand children and childhood in general, particularly what is their perceptions about harm and risks and the vulnerabilities in their everyday lives, and also what are the protective factors that exist in the community, which helped to establish a community-based child protection system in the slum communities. So while doing that, I want to take a child-centered approach where I want to engage with the children with ethnographic research approach, want to work with them to know about their experiences, and also I want to engage with the families and other community people to know their perceptions about these everyday risks. And while doing this, I'm inspired by the work of Resilience Research Project, and particularly Michael Unger, where I want to look at the resilience metrics, where both the internal factors, that is the resilience and vulnerability of the individuals, and also the external factors, which is the protective environment and the adversity that they have. I want to look into that matrix. And also I want to focus on the internal resources that they have, and also the external support. It can be emotional, psychological, sociological, physical, other resources that they navigate and negotiate to access those resources, which helped them to thrive in that difficult situation. So I hope that since there has not been any research on focusing on the resilience of the children who are living in that difficult context, I want to contribute to that unexplored area of knowledge. And I also hope that these research findings will help the policymakers and probably the development organizations to frame and to establish some to contribute in the national child protection system. Thank you.
My work is entitled Children Participation in South America. We analyze in the academic production of sociology of childhood in South America. So it's a part of my PhD study, with a part of my research group study, who is trying to identify the childhood studies in South America, the production and research and sociology of childhood perspective. And we identify participation as a frequent object in this production. For this, I start to searching on childhood studies in websites just about speak Spanish in countries, because in Brazil, my research group already done a research about who is working with sociology of childhood. So I just need to look for the others in South America. After this, I identify the bibliographic reference to identify if there are dialogue with the field. I looking for the main researchers, so I consult the curriculum and look for how many times how long time they are working with childhood, in which perspective, in which way, if they have research group. And after this, I contact all them by email and select some to do the research. I visit the countries and interview researchers to understand a little bit more about how the participation of childhood is developing in South America. The countries that more have academic production is Colombia, Peru, and Chile, according to my survey, and in Brazil, according to the survey done by my research group. And now they are in development. I'm in the middle of the PhD study, and my research group started to understand the children's participation in Brazil last year, so we were working together in this topic. And the conclusions is partial. Now we are trying to identify, analyze different settings of children's participation and identify more researchers that participation is an important subject in South America. So we want to know who is working with this, how is working with this, how this discussed our development. With authors, they are discussing if they are based on our theory or if they are constructing their own. And discuss this topic to contribute and consolidate the fight in South America with my research group. I think that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so I use narrative as data. So I'm going to start mine with a story. As a lot of researchers do, it comes from a very personal space. So I was born in Toronto, raised in Brampton, just outside of Toronto. My parents are both from India, and I grew up in a house where everyone was a human rights activist. So I knew that when I did my education, it was going to have something to do with my parents and their villages, and something to do with human rights, because the whole purpose of me getting an education was to give back to a community I'd never been to. And so for my master's research, I went to my dad's village to look at, it was originally going to be an institutional ethnography, looking at the Convention on the Rights of the Child and how it worked in preschools in my village. So I went into my village with all of the authority that a graduate student has, this Canadian trained, and I went into the preschool and asked to see their policy documents around the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I hear some laughs because I think some people here know what happened. I kind of fell flat on my face. Nobody trusted me. Nobody knew what I was talking about. There were no policy documents on the Convention on the Rights of the Child in rural Butala in India. So I had to reimagine my entire, at that point I defended my proposal. I got funding from the Canadian International Development Agency, and I had to go back and explain that everything that I had done sitting in Canada just didn't exist when I got to the village in India. And then I started kind of developing this understanding of why, and that's kind of what turned into my failed, and there's no failed research, but what my master's research couldn't show, my PhD research explored why, is looking at what textual mediation, and that's kind of one of the key terms in institutional ethnography, what that means. And what it means that my village is not a textually mediated society. So that roughly, if I could do it in like 15 seconds, a textually mediated society, so the part of me that is very Canadian, I operate in a textually mediated society. Everything we do, from the way we work with children, to the way we live, the way we're educated, everything is controlled by text. And I use examples from, I worked in Canadian preschools. So the Day Nurseries Act, which tells you how long a child is to be outside, for how many hours a day, and we would bundle up all these children in Canadian winters and take them outside, and we'd stand there staring at our watches because nobody wanted to be outside. But if we brought the children in a minute early and someone from the ministry came to check, we could lose our license. So the way that we interacted with those children, their bodies, their time, their space, it was all related to this writing in this policy document. And I have pictures, and I'll hit play, or you can come up here and go through them, so that you really understand what this non-textually mediated space is. In the preschools in my village, there are no walls, no rooms, no documents, no printers, no photocopiers, no curriculum, no policy. There are other forces that drive life, but text is not one of them. And so that becomes a problem when, and here's my, where's Ginny?
I'm here.
Yes, okay, so my overly simplified model, because this is like hundreds of pages of my writing trying to be put into one poster, and I could write pages on every single one of these links. But what ends up happening is that you have something like the CRC, which is, it reproduces itself in text. It assumes that all writing is mediated by text. It's an inherent assumption. It doesn't actually have power in what I would argue for some of the children who need it the most, who are not in these spaces of text. And so even in the children in my village, some of them who could afford to go to private schools, they were more in those kind of spaces that were controlled by text. So even amongst those children, access to those textually mediated spaces was kind of changed by their gender, their caste, their class, their age, and so there's all these different and very complicated, so it moves into a space of being complicated, this very complicated relationship that they have with the CRC. So I guess the whole issue of children's rights needs to be reimagined in a way that doesn't involve text, or have a parallel that isn't solely relying on text. Okay.
So my name's Chris. I'm with the Open University under the supervision of Jean Grugel. I started my PhD just in October, so this is sort of where I'm at so far. And I want to look at the voices of children that work in Bolivia and Ecuador. And I'm sort of, I don't know, I'm torn whether I focus just on one country. You could get a lot out of both Bolivia and Ecuador separately, or whether to do a comparison between them. So the context that sort of my research has come from, there's a left turn in Latin America, a lot of leftist governments, there's a bit of a pink turn that it's called, and specifically with Bolivia and Ecuador and the Andean region, there's been a period of transformation that's being hotly debated at the minute. Specifically with Bolivia and Ecuador, there's sort of a rise in indigenous politics and indigenous politicization. And that's at sort of all political levels, and they've both got sort of a hot civil society that's very active, that plays sort of a big part within the political sphere. And they both had new constitutions, Ecuador in 2008, Bolivia in 2009, and specifically with regard to child labour, they both sort of outright prohibited it from a certain age. Bolivia sort of recognises that there is activity within families that child labour might not be an adequate term for, that it does allow for. And Ecuador specifically sort of set a limit of 15 to work. But interestingly with Bolivia, as recent as 2014, they set a new code for children and adolescents that allowed children from the age of 10 to work, provided they were self-employed, and also set a minimum wage at the age of 14 to sort of, from their point of view, try and safeguard those children that work. Sort of in the title, because I'm sort of going through what I'm doing at the minute, I've sort of used the term children that work because with child labour it's got a lot of connotations. It can be a bit of a problematic term, quite negative connotations, because I'm not sure of the group of children that I will be working with at the minute. I've just gone with children that work, because often sort of child labour suggests that there's an economic profit for the children that work, but of course there's children that work in rural areas, in agricultural sectors, that's not, for them, might not be seen as work, it's just part of lifestyle. And sort of figures, there's a couple of graphs I appreciate you can't see, so if you want to have a look. In Bolivia there's 850,000 5 to 17 year olds that work. But that's sort of economic activities, so quite broadly, which is 28% of that age group. And the large majority of them do work in rural areas or in agriculture. But then there's also a high number of them that also work with work in areas that are classed as dangerous, so that speaks to sort of ILO conventions about work and hazardous work. In Ecuador there's 359,000 5 to 17 year olds at work, which is about 8% of that demographic, and again they're much higher in rural areas. There's also a bit of a debate going on in Bolivia and sort of South America about the eradication or abolitionism of child labour against the legalisation and the protectionism of it. So on one side, for eradication, the ILO position is that child labour is fundamentally intolerable. Working is a violation of innocence, which speaks to ideas of childhood, and labour can remove children from education, it can affect their development, but also, and more specifically with regards to harmful forms of child labour, it's also detrimental to development, and whether that's physically or mentally. And on the other side, Bolivia specifically would argue, especially with their Code of Children, that actually that's an international agenda being forced on countries that might not necessarily be appropriate. Children's work can and should be valued. Education can be age-based discrimination, and also children take pride in their work, and that work can actually add to their development, which includes socialisation, and it can also prepare children that for quite bluntly, realistically will end up working, so it's preparation for them for the future. So there's two sides of the argument, which has led me to my sort of research question, what are the voices of children that work in Bolivia and Ecuador? Specifically, I hope to try and look at what are young people's voices on that eradication, legalisation debate, who has the voices, and more importantly, who doesn't have a voice in that debate, who's silent in that debate, and why are they silent? And also, what does the research say about the context of the political transformation that's ongoing in Bolivia and Ecuador, in the Andean region, and in Latin America itself? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name's Anne Luke. I'm a lecturer in childhood studies from the University of Derby. And for this workshop, I prepared the poster presentation specifically trying to directly relate the work and the research that I'm carrying out on Cuba, on childhood in Cuba, to the themes of the conference. So I think what I'll do now is just talk you through the research which I'm carrying out and which is fed into the perspectives that I have which are on here, and then maybe a little bit about routes forward and ways in which that fits into the kind of narratives of or the questions that have been asked as part of the project of this conference. So first of all, where does my research on what I've called the construction of everyday revolutionary childhoods in Cuba come from? It comes out of my own research, which began as research into youth and the political culture and the culture of youth in Cuba, which was my doctoral research from 2007. But subsequently I've broadened that out a little bit to have a look at this theme of childhood. So where I went from youth, which looked at theories of subcultures, identity, agency, moral panic in particular was important. When I came to engage with notions of childhood in the Cuban case, and my studies essentially historical, I found myself engaging with a different body of literature. At two conferences I've sort of presented these findings from this new research that I'm conducting. First of all, research on the Pioneers Organization, which was the communist childhood or the childhood organization established in the 1960s in Cuba and expanded in the late 1960s to become an organization which which young people were members in large numbers, and more than 90% numbers. So that was that piece of research. And secondly, the research that I'm doing on childhood has been come across in two papers which I presented. One of them which looked at the Pioneers Organisation, which was the children's organisation created in the 1960s for
Cheers, thank you.
Children of the age of 8 upwards, and it's a very interesting organisation which started as very small but became something which more than 90% of children in Cuba were and are members of. So that was looking at that, and particularly looking at that in terms of its relationship to youth, childhood and youth, where they meet, and that's one of the questions that I'm developing. And secondly, looking a little bit at the Cuban home and how certainly in early childhood education, now with a new initiative called the Educa Tu Hijo initiative, early childhood education is now entering the home as a conceptually, and the idea is that the educators can be educators within that very home. So an idea of the culture of education permeating Cuban childhood through that. So the findings of this project so far in terms of building up a constructing a revolutionary childhood. Here you can see this little poster from 1961, Estudio, Trabajo y Felicidad para los Niños, study, work and happiness for children. The same for youth would be Estudio, Trabajo, Fusil, study, work, the rifle. So you can see how the kind of notions of happiness enter in that, into that construction of childhood. But also here, José Martí, the liberation hero of Cuba from 1898, revolutionary hero Camilo Cienfuegos, and these, so the kind of influence which draw into the construction of childhood come from, yes, the pioneer, modelled on a Russian pioneers organisation, but drawing in the Cuban Revolution, Cuban nationalism, and broader concepts of broader construction of childhood as the happy period in the child's life, and a link between that and leisure, and the focus on leisure, which is one of my questions. So one of the themes, though, that comes out in terms of the documentary research is definitely that work is seen as central. So estudio, trabajo, work, and study and work as central to the nature of childhood, and that work is not just an economic issue, but also a moral issue, a cornerstone of kind of a socialist morality, if you like. And secondly, the other kind of vein that you see running through the documentary history of the revolution is a kind of focus on what I call culture and didacticism, so that you see education permeating culture and culture permeating education. So here you see a little cartoon character, Duendecillo, in a children's magazine, telling the story of how toys are produced in Cuba. So he becomes the kind of an educator, but is also and throughout the magazine you see, throughout the issues you see Duendecillo popping up as educator, educator both in practicalities but also in terms of moral education. And a little quote from the Instituto de la Infancia, which was from the 1970s, an institute for early childhood, which was created. And again, there was a focus on moral education, but the shift in focus was towards the home. So, and this was very interesting because there's a conflict in socialist history about what is the role of the home, and you certainly see that the importance of the home, and that's one of the issues which I've explored in this work. So, I think that does this relate to what we have covered in this workshop here? I think certain notions from childhood studies are already there and operating within Cuban studies, if you like, or Cuban childhoods and Cuban studies on education in particular. So the notions of capital, social capital, have been drawn in. I think the nature of the relationship between the state and the home is one that is worth exploring further, and also the politics of childhood, looking at how there's work which has been done by Anita Casavantes Bradford on how children were used in both in Miami and in Havana as a kind of a political tool. So that's where it's already, childhood studies, if you like, already exists. Secondly, a theoretical priority in terms of looking at Cuban childhood would certainly be more of an attempt to focus or theoretically focus on the culture of the everyday, but without having to focus on the culture of the individual. So that's where I think it might be theoretically quite useful, looking at that, trying to explore the everyday. Another issue which occurred to me with this conference was whether Cuba fit into this paradigm of the global south. What does Cuba self-define in terms of the global south? Certainly I would say that Cuba sees itself as a leader in some ways in South-South development, and policies such as medical internationalism embed that leadership role, and as a member of the non-aligned movement. So can we put Cuba into that narrative, was my question to myself there, and would Cuba put itself into that narrative? Challenges when thinking about the Cuban case. My work is essentially, this work I've done on childhood is a historical study, so it's a documentary study, but of course looking at it from today, from 2015, we need to conceptualize new the meaning of current changes in Cuba in terms of what effect has that had on the construction of childhood which we've seen. So future directions where I think I see this research going. One thing that I want to do is to broaden out where I look at these influences, to broaden out in terms of time. So have a look at pre-revolutionary influences into that construction of childhood, particularly Pan-Latin Americanism and Latin American collaboration on childhood through the 1920s onwards. I would like to explore this idea of work as a moral issue, and I think it kind of somewhere feeds into that labour work debate when we look at morality. I would like to look at the possible conflict between that notion of work as a moral issue, but also the notion of leisure. So where does that fit in? And a final question, which relates me right back to where I started, which was looking at youth and youth culture, is why do we Why is there no moral panic evident over childhood, whereas there repeatedly is over youth in the Cuban case? So what happens at that transition from childhood to youth, and when and what is that transition? So that, in a summary, is where I am with my research on childhood in Cuba at present. Thank you very much.